Well, hi, it's Stacey here. Welcome. We are about to be in our quarterly interactive webcast, which has a particularly interesting topic this quarter: removing resistance to PuMP with polarity thinking. Now, this is not something I'm an expert in. I'm fascinated by it though, because when my PuMP partner in Africa, Peter Nda, when he told me that he and his colleague Jerry were working with polarity thinking and blending it into PuMP and really discovering some unique ways to introduce PuMP to people and help them explore its concepts, I was just blown away by it. So I'm so glad that they've agreed to collaborate with me on this interactive webcast with you. The challenge that we have with most change projects like PuMP is sustaining the momentum once the project gets implemented. After all that initial hype, I guess sometimes nothing really happens and nothing really changes. Commitments that get made at the project's inception can be forgotten, and it's too easy, as we know, to slip back into the bad habits that the change project's meant to address. So a sense of stuckness sets in, and frustrations just keep building. And this is why we need a different way of managing and sustaining change. So I'm really excited to be able to bring you that very different way of managing and sustaining change that we all want, which we call PuMP. Now, I have two other great people hosting this webcast with me today, my licensed PuMP partners for Africa, Jerry Faith and Peter Nda of BC. Now, some of you have kind of met Peter before online with me. We've done a few webcasts in the past, but this is Jerry's first collaboration with us, which is pretty exciting. BC have been working with me as PuMP partners since 2013, which is such a long time ago, and they've become the masters of using PuMP, particularly for strategy execution. More recently, they have become experts in polarity thinking, and they've done some very innovative application of this into some of what I call the PuMP memes, and exploring them in a way that I just never had thought of before. It just struck me that using polarity thinking the way they have is a great way to reduce the threat of a new performance measurement method, specifically PuMP. So Jerry and Peter, thanks for giving your time to share your work with us on this with our PuMP community.
Stacey, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Jerry, as you've heard, and with me is my colleague Peter, who will introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webcast.
So with Peter and Jerry, we're going to find out what polarities are, how powerful they can be as an engaging way to introduce new ideas. We're going to explore some of the polarities that PuMP that kind of put PuMP into balance with old practices rather than confronting them. We're going to learn one of the polarities that you can start to use when you're introducing colleagues and leaders to PuMP for the first time, and there'll also be time to answer your questions as well about reducing resistance to PuMP and using polarities. So Peter and Jerry will lead most of this webcast. I'm going to keep track of any questions that you ask along the way. I may even have some questions too, but for now, and Jerry, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Stacey. Peter, thank you. Really, I'm glad to be sharing this platform with you in a subject that I'm pretty passionate about, and that is very close to my heart. Now, I'm aware that not everyone is familiar with the concept of polarity thinking, and therefore we will start by defining what polarities are. Sometimes some people call them wicked problems, paradoxes, dilemmas, VUCA problems. So anytime you hear any of these terminologies, you know that you are dealing with a polarity. And once you start understanding and appreciating polarities, you actually see them everywhere. Think ratio, polarization, Black Lives Matter, but so do white lives. They matter too. So here you've got two rights. Think health and economy as a polarity we are dealing with right now during the COVID era. So polarities, and Stacey, you can move on, they are unsolvable and combinate interdependent pairs of value that help you to create the whole. There are also energy systems that have a predictable flow of energy that you can leverage. And actually the key thing with polarities is seeing the two sides of it and leveraging it in order to manage any resistances that may come in. So here we are dealing with something that is unsolvable, interdependent, predictable. And we can move on because I really want to illustrate what it means to work with a polarity that has got two accurate points of view. And on their own, really they're incomplete. If you work with one pole of a polarity, you are working with an incomplete truth. I want to illustrate this using a real life example. We can move to the next slide, Stacey. I want to share a polarity that my colleague Peter is working with at the moment. Peter has taken up jogging and running. In these times, he's got a lot of time in his hands. COVID has given him that, thankfully. So he's decided to take up running with the aim of participating in the next Standard Chartered Marathon. We are not sure when it will happen next, but he says, the next time it comes, I am in it. Now, for those of you who know anything about running, it's not just about putting one foot after the other. It's a lot more taxing, both to the mind and the body. And therefore, for one to be healthy, fit, to run a marathon, you have to work with two poles of a polar. That is activity and rest. Those two are interdependent. So Peter has to leverage the two poles to be able to run the marathon and finish it if possible. He hasn't said anything about winning, but he truly wants to finish it. So in the next slide, you will see how Peter is managing to leverage his polarity. So the map on the screen is what we call a polarity map. It is a wisdom organizer that has helped Peter to map out his desired results. And Stacey, we can move on to show where we place the desired results. We call them the greater purpose. The map also shows Peter the actions he needs to take to leverage his two poles, the activity and rest. The two are interdependent, and at any one time, he has to make sure that he's working on both, leveraging both. So Peter has identified activity and rest as the two poles that he's working with. If he focuses, you'll notice that if Peter focuses, I think, Stacey, we can display the whole map so that we talk through it.
All of it, Jerry, every.
Yes, so that we keep moving from one point to the other.
I think that's the whole map now.
Thank you. So in Peter's polarity map, you can see he has identified the outcome that he wants, what he's calling the greater purpose, and that is running and finishing the marathon. Now, for him to be able to do that, he has to leverage the two poles, activity and rest. He has also identified the upsides of activity and the downsides of activity. The upside of activity is that he will get increased endurance, and rest will help him to build his muscles. And this will ultimately help him to finish the marathon, run and finish the marathon. Note, he's identified the downsides of two poles. If Peter focuses too much on the activity pole, he's likely to injure himself. That is a downside of that pole. If he injures himself, he's likely to take rest for a longer time, and that could lead to his muscles having problems. So I hope you can see that Peter has to leverage the two poles to be able to increase his endurance and build his muscles. Now, to leverage those two poles, he has identified the action steps on the upper side of the quadrant. So he has to run further on each day, on each workout, every day, to be able to increase his endurance. And he has got to get adequate downtime between workout days to give his muscles time to build. Now, if he focuses on the activity pole and neglects rest, he's likely to start experiencing the downsides of activity. Now, note he has identified early warnings, which are indicators that tell him that he's getting into the downside of either pole. So if he focuses too much on endurance, increasing his endurance, he's likely to start feeling tired when he wakes up in the morning. That's an indicator that he's over-focusing on one pole. And the same thing applies to the rest pole. If he over-focuses on resting, he's likely to start experiencing muscle atrophy. So when he works with the two poles, he's able to leverage the energy between the two poles. Now, this energy between is what, if it's not leveraged properly, leads to resistance. Resistance to one side of the pole when you over-focus on one pole. And so you can see that when you identify your polarities early, you are able to develop your dual strategy that will help you to achieve or accomplish your greater purpose. Now, we can move on, Stacy, to the next slide. And if there are any questions, yes, questions.
No questions at this point. You're making it so clear, Derry. So yeah, no questions at the moment from our audience or from me. It just makes so much sense the way you're explaining it.
Thank you very much, Stacy. So Dr. Barry Johnson, and his partners at the Polarity Partnerships PLC have come up with a very simple tool that helps you, as a person who is interested in polarity management, to leverage your polarities. And the tool, which is a 5-step tool, helps you to see the underlying polarities that you need to leverage, especially when you are implementing change like PuMP. It also helps you to map, like Peter did, your polarity so that you can get clarity about what you need to pay attention to. It also helps you to assess how you will engage all the stakeholders, employees, your board members, other critical stakeholders. It helps you to learn about how you'll understand and interpret the assessment results, and also inquire into what contributed to those results. And there are three questions that we normally ask ourselves when we are learning. How do we understand these results? For example, we also ask ourselves what contributed to the results we are looking at, whether they are negative or positive. And then what you learn in that step will support the actions that you take in order to leverage the polarity. So when you're working with a polarity, when you're leveraging a polarity, it's actually a continuous dance between the two poles. At one point, you lean towards one pole. At another point, you lean towards the other pole. And then sometimes you are right in the middle. The ability to carry on that dance is what enables you to manage resistance. Take PuMP, for example. When you're implementing PuMP, it doesn't mean you're doing that in a vacuum. There is what exists, and that informs one part of the polarity. And then you've got the PuMP you're implementing, and that forms the second part of the polarity. This must be leveraged, and you have to engage and involve everybody in this process. Peter will share with you examples of polarities that we have identified as we work with clients. And he'll also take you through a complete polarity and demonstrate how you can use the tool or the polarity lens to manage resistance and even turn it into a resource in your organizations, in your situation. And I now invite Peter to do that for us. Peter? Peter, are you there?
You're on mute, Peter. There we go.
Thank you, Jerry. Stacy. Implementing PuMP requires an organization to replace some bad performance measurement habits with good habits. Replacing the bad habits does not necessarily mean choosing good over bad habits. It is best to look at the bad and good habits as polarity manage. Some few examples here of some polarities to manage. For instance, strategy needs to be broad to cover all areas of the business, and it needs to be at 30,000 feet. And therefore, the language used tends to be vague or wizardry. But for it to be implementable and cascaded across the organization, it needs to be clear and specific, that is easily understood by everyone in the organization. And we can see the two poles there: broad strategy, understandable strategy. Again, performance measurement is seen as a few hours of KPI brainstorming at the end of an annual planning workshop, rather than a subsystem of a whole system. We forget that it is a feedback loop that links strategy, reporting, and continuous improvement together into an integrated system or process of managing business performance. So again, there we see the polarity of event and process. Again, performance measures are used as products to report to executives and other stakeholders on performance. And also, we use them to give useful insights into performance. So again, using measures to report and using measures to gain insight is a polarity that needs to be managed. Another polarity to be managed is on the report itself or reporting performance. The content, design, and publishing of performance reports needs to meet the needs of the targeted audience, and it needs to be structured. Thus, performance reporting has to be both flexible and structured, because if you're targeting a specific individual with a report, they might have specific preferences on how you report to them. But again, we need to have them structured so that they stick to everybody, and we have an organized way of reporting performance. And the last but not least, which is my favorite polarity, which I see every time, is where we use measures to control people, activities, and resources to achieve goals. This is using many measures to ensure that things are done right. And then we also use measures to learn what's holding back performance, to learn whether we have achieved our goals or not. And these are two polarities again, where we're using measures to control and using measures to ensure that the right things are done right. So, and these are a very, very common polarities that have come across a lot in most organizations. So leveraging on these polarities will enable you to speed up the implementation of PuMP and ensure that it is sustainable. Let's look at the example of manage and learn poles, and how we can leverage on the energy between these two poles to increase buy-in for PuMP projects. And I'll illustrate this using a polarity map, which Faith talked about earlier.
Peter, just before you take us through this, I think everyone can see that it's going to be quite detailed, and that's going to make it quite useful. So everyone, we decided to make this particular slide, the finished product of it, a handout, and you can download it now, the PDF of the handout. It's called PuMP Polarity Handout, and it's in the handout section of your webcast control panel. If you're having trouble finding that, just type something in the questions box, and Claire, who's always supporting these webcasts in the background, she'll be able to point you in the right direction or help you find it. But that'll be a fantastic handout for you to have, because it has all the detail that Peter's about to take us through. So sorry, Peter, back to you.
Thank you. So the great purpose of using measures is to improve performance. And when we're implementing PuMP, most likely, or when we want to implement PuMP, most likely it's because we're experiencing the downside of the managed pole. And some of these downsides that we experience include using measures to assess performance by comparing one data point with another, say this month to last month, this week to last week. Another downside we might be experiencing is having performance shortfalls and missed target being blamed on people or outside forces, or using measures to assess people performance rather than to gain insights on what's happening, what needs to be improved. We could be having a situation where most performance targets are missed, though the focus is on hitting targets. So we find that daily people are looking at targets and wanting to hit those targets, but still we find the targets are missed. And of course, rushing to implement ideas and initiative without testing first. So this situation, most of the time we see in lots of organizations when we go in, they're experiencing this downside because of over-focusing on the managed pole at the expense of the learn pole. To correct this, then we bring in PuMP, and PuMP brings the benefits or the upside of learning. And we the results we are looking for when we introduce PuMP, and we start experiencing this perhaps in the initial stages of implementing PuMP, is that we start using statistical valid methods to determine when performance has changed so that we can react to differences that are part of the, different that are not the differences that are real rather than the normal variations in our data. Performance shortfalls are analyzed and the root causes are found and fixed. That's the situation we want to be in. We are looking for a result like we use measures to assess business and process performance and as a tool for people to make decisions and take actions. We want most performance targets to be achieved, and we want to use measures to test strategies and improvement initiatives before we fully implement those initiatives. So we are looking for these results when we implement PuMP, and indeed, most likely we reach an agreement that those are the benefits of PuMP, and we start implementing. But as soon as we start implementing, a couple of months, after this, maybe 2-3 months or more, we start experiencing the downside of over-focusing on the learn part. And some of these downsides are, not reacting to each change or variation in performance. People are used to reacting to change or variation when they see it, and now they can't. They have to wait until the performance is reported. Sometimes you get paralysis analysis. Lots of time people feel there's a lot of time being taken to analyze data, find the root cause of performance. Then we feel sometimes that we don't hold people accountable for performance as before, because whenever there's a variation, in the managed form, you ask for explanation from people, and you want to hold them accountable for that. Also, people are not motivated to achieve more once targets are reached. That is the sense that, once targets are reached, because here we are talking about performance levels. So when the performance levels is reached, there's that feeling that people are not motivated to move to a higher performance level. And it sometimes takes too long, or we take too long to implement improvement ideas or initiatives because we got to test those strategies, those initiatives, before we implement. So we start experiencing this downside, and people start moving back to the managed form. And you start finding people reacting to each change or variation in performance, in variation in performance. So you find people going back to daily monitoring, weekly monitoring. So they go back to the old ways because they feel that PuMP is not allowing them to react to change or variation in performance when it happens. The other thing you start observing is people go back to the benefits of managing, which is the next benefit of managing, which is using experience and instincts to make quick decisions, about performance rather than analyzing data. You're again seeing people going back to holding people accountable for performance. Yeah, so performance is, whenever something happens, somebody is responsible for it, and people want explanations for that. You find people starting to monitor targets. Yeah, these are the targets for the performance results on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. So that corrective actions are taken. Now, I want to say something about this because it's a very common problem. As I said earlier, when we are using measures to manage performance, it's about making sure things are done right. When we are using measures to learn, it's to make sure the right things are done. All right, or doing things right. Okay, or we're doing the right things, right? Let me say so. Yeah, the first one is, sorry about that. We're using measures to ensure that things are done right. The other one is in learning, we're using measures to ensure the right things are done. Now, in using measures to ensure the right things are, to ensure things are done right, we forget that these are different type of measures: task measures, output measures. You know, we forget that, and we confuse that with the measures we use for learning, which is the ones we develop under PuMP, which are result measures, which are outcome measures. This confusion exists a lot in organization, and there's nothing wrong with monitoring targets on a daily basis, but the right targets. You need to understand why you're monitoring on a daily basis. Are you monitoring to ensure things are done right? Okay, or are you monitoring to ensure you're doing the right things? So that difference is very important. And the other upside of using measures to manage is being able to quickly and decisively act, you know, on ideas or initiatives, so that you can correct whatever is not being, whenever what is not being done right. So you find people going back to that those old habits, and it's not, I just want to emphasize, it's not that the old habits are wrong or bad, but it's the context within which we're using them and for what purpose, right? Now, to help you manage the implementation of PuMP, it's good to have a conversation and develop this map with the leadership team or the design team, the measure design team or the measure team, as we call it. You know, have a conversation, identify the upsides and downsides of each of the polarities that you have come up with, okay? And it is important then, once you have identified, to know the early warnings or the indicators that you are focusing on one pole at the expense of the other pole. For instance, if you're focusing on the managed pole, some of the downsides you'll see, or the early warnings, sorry, you will see, especially when people are assessing performance by comparing one data point to another, is you'll find that a lot of time is being spent explaining performance rather than improving performance. Now, when that happens, you start realizing, hey, something is wrong here, you know, and you are over focusing on manage. The other early warning, which is about performance shortfalls and missed targets are blamed on people. The early warning for that is you find measures do not inform decisions on what needs improvement. So, in other words, the measures don't form the agenda for your performance meetings, you know, and therefore, you know, people are blamed. There's no root cause analysis to identify the real causes of poor performance. And then the other example is, you know, when you experience the downside of using measures to assess performance, the early warning for that would be, you know, finding departments, teams, and individuals achieving their targets, but there's no change in organizational performance. So you find people, you know, achieving, but the organization as a whole is not achieving. That tells you there's something not right there. And then the other last one, early warning, which relates to rushing to judgment on initiatives, is finding most initiatives are about resources, education, or funding. So you need to be, when you develop a map, you need to identify the early warnings, which are indicators basically, and these can should be measured as measurable as possible. You know, so there should be evidence that you are on the downside of this pole. Okay. There are also some downsides of the land pole that I've identified. I'll not go through all of them, but say perhaps you can just highlight them there. So some of the downsides you will experience. And as I said before, it's important that this is a conversation and the design team identifies this. Okay. Now, what the polarity management helps you do is to identify the action points or the action steps to take when you're experiencing any of these, or when you detect any of these early warnings, right? Now, for instance, if you detect that people that is on the land, on the land pole, if you detect that the first, I'm talking about the first early warning, if you detect that people no longer use graphs that signal or give them signal of performance, they don't use that anymore, they're reverting back to dials and gauges and etc., then you need to, the action you need to take is use time series graphs that filter noise and identify really performance signals. So when you find that downside is coming in there, you need to remind people, hey, wait a minute, we need to use graphs that are time series graphs that give us signal or filter noise and give us the true signals of performance. If we look at the other side on the early warnings on the managed pole, and you find a lot of people are spending time explaining performance, again, the same action could help you. Focus them on using time series graph that filter noise. Now, when you have an action like that addresses both sides of both poles, then that's a really good action point because it means you're killing two birds with one stone. But in most cases, it's not the same. In this particular example, that same action point could help. Yeah, and remember these action points are agreed with the leadership team at the initial when you're introducing the PuMP, and this becomes your change management framework basically. You know, so everybody's agreeable that when you see this early warning, then we need to take this action, and that action you take. There are some other actions there which Stacey, for the sake of time, you can just highlight, and I will not go through each one of them, but we try to come with an action point to address each of the early warning points. Okay. Likewise, so you can see the action points on both sides, and they're all addressing, they're all triggered by the early warning in order to address a specific downside, so that you remain on the upside of your poles, and therefore leverage on the energy between those two poles to use measures to improve performance.
So Peter, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I think I might have had some of the build in the slide kind of a little bit messed up there, but I wanted to clarify. So if we find ourselves on the negative side, the downside of the manage pole, and we see those early warnings that are on the bottom left, the ones like a lot of time is spent explaining performance rather than improving it. If we see those early warnings, does that mean that we go straight up above to the action steps above it? And then we would do that first action step because that deals with the first early warning sign. So we stay on the left?
Yes, on the left, yes. If you see any of these downsides, you look at the appropriate action points on the left and implement that.
And so likewise, if we see an early warning sign over on the right, where we've got the downside of the learn polarity, those early warning signs on the right would lead us to take the actions above those at the top right of the diagram.
Exactly. For instance, if we see that we have started using measures again to assess people performance, then we need to make sure we assign measures to a performance owner and hold them accountable for tracking the measure and improving performance rather than holding them accountable for the measure itself. So you correct that by taking that action point if it's not, you haven't done it yet. Yeah. So it helps us as a reminder because this tool is about conversation, really, at the end of the day. So when you have these conversations, it helps as a reminder. And again, another thing I want to mention, there is a loop there you can see. That's called an infinity loop, which we want it to be on the upside, just as illustrated there. Now, Faith talked earlier about assessment. What we normally do is use these upsides and downsides, the values we want and those downsides, we create a questionnaire and we get people to rate each of these, where they think they are on each one of these. And from that assessment, then you can draw another infinity loop and see where you are. So you have a target loop, perhaps, like this could be a perfect loop, what you're seeing there, you know, and it could have where you are. And that helps you now monitor periodically in terms of your implementation of PuMP. Are you moving to that? Are you moving towards the up the upward side of the loop, or are you moving towards the downside of the loop? So it's a powerful tool. We can't discuss the whole tool here today and finish, but it just shows you, just to illustrate to you that we have got a better way now that we can manage our PuMP implementation and carry along people, and therefore achieve success quicker and sustain that success of the PuMP project.
Yeah,
I love how, oh, sorry, Jerry, please.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on further to your question. Usually what happens, we notice there is a problem within the organization and that comes on the left-hand side where manager is sitting. So we do a gap analysis and we identify gaps in performance. And those gaps are what usually sits on the downside of the left-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come up with ways to bridge those gaps, the interventions, the change that we want. And usually that is what we place on the upside of learning. Now, if we focus on bridging the gaps on the left-hand side, the downside, and to the neglect of what is working at the moment, which is the upside of manage, what happens is we fall into the downsides of both poles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, please repeat it. I mean, this is.
Let me repeat that.
Yes.
When we have a situation, an issue, a shortfall in an organization, what we do is we carry out a gap analysis and we identify the gaps in performance. And those gaps are what will sit in a polarity map on the downside of the left-hand side where manage is.
Yes.
So, and then we come up with ways of bridging those gaps, what we call solutions in quotes.
Yeah.
And that is what will sit on the right-hand side on the upside.
Yes.
So we usually come up with that to manage the downsides of the left-hand side. Okay? Now, in many cases, we tend to forget what we have been working with, which is the good on the left-hand side where manage is sitting.
Yes.
So when that happens, we tend to fall into the lower side of both poles.
Uh-huh.
Am I making sense? So for example, if I can just use what is on the screen, under manage, you may as an organization find that you are having issues with assessing performance. You notice that there is performance shortfall, you are missing your targets, you're using your measures to assess people. You notice that most performance targets are missed through focus, and the focus is on hitting the targets, and then you rush to implement initiatives without testing fast. So those are gaps that you identify.
Yes.
And therefore, to respond to that, you go into the learn pole and you come up with ways to manage those gaps in the manage downside. And you say, going forward, we shall be using statistically valid methods. This is where you are implementing PuMP to manage the issues on the manage side.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Now, if you forget that there is another pole of managing where people react to each change or variation in performance and use experience and instincts to make quick decisions. If you forget all that, what happens is there will be resistance by the people who see value in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And when that happens, when resistance happens, then you find that you'll start experiencing the downsides, because remember, you've got two dual strategies working here. You'll start experiencing the downsides of both, because you'll have people who are neglecting manage, they are using learning only, and you've got people who are using managing only and neglecting learning.
Yeah.
And when there is that tension, if you're not able to manage that tension, then you experience resistance.
So the idea of the polarity, of it being a map, of it being based in this principle that nobody's wrong,
yes.
the idea is that we must keep that balance between both sides of the map. And if we forget about that balance, if it gets out of balance, if we go too far in one direction or the other, then we are going to create a resistance. And that resistance pushes us all down into the bottom part of the map where none of us want to be.
Yes. So none of you is wrong. And therefore, if you don't create that, let me call it the balance between the two poles, then of course there will be that tension. There'll be people who will not use your pump, and they'll call it your pump. And there'll be people who will again push away what you've been using before.
Yeah.
And therefore, the tension is real. There is value in experience and instinct. There is value in using change or variation. If you're working with performance indicator, if you're working with indicators for now I'm forgetting what I was going to say, but yes, there is value in what is sitting on the upper side of manage. Yeah. And if you ignore that, then it means those who believe in it will push back on your PuMP initiatives, and you'll start experiencing the downsides of both poles.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. I think for all of you listening, and you know me and the way I write and the way, like I do talk about right and wrong, and partly that's because I'm trying to be a bit provocative and to really highlight the difference between traditional practices and what we're trying to do with PuMP. But there's only so far you can get with that kind of thinking, and I think you can all see now why I'm so excited by what Njeri and Peter are doing with this, because the power, I think, in this polarity thinking and blending it with some of these PuMP polarities is that it takes away that feeling that anybody's wrong, nobody's wrong, everybody's right. There's good aspects to both what has been there in the past and what we're trying to create for the future with PuMP. So I think we will find a lot more leverage to break down resistance with PuMP by following this. This is the first time I've really dived in deeply with it. I didn't want to come into this webcast knowing and understanding what Peter and Jenny were going to share with us. I wanted to sit here and be with you and experience it the way you're experiencing it. And at least for me, it's been it's just been clear and logical, and at the same time it's got I think a lot of hope in it for adopting an approach like this to really try and reinvent the way that we introduce people to PuMP and we introduce PuMP into our organizations. It's just fantastic. Before I hand back to you both, David's just made a comment here I'd like to share. He says, I love this perspective for not just reducing barriers to PuMP, but also for ourselves as we implement, to be self-aware of when we are oscillating towards one pole or another. And that, I think that's quite a great realization as well, don't you think?
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. So is there anything else either of you wanted to add to what you've already so generously shared with us about polarities and PuMP, or will we go to questions?
We can go into questions, Stacey.
Yeah, cool. Okay, thanks, Peter. All right, so anybody, if you've got a question right now or a comment like David shared, if you just want to share your thoughts about this, please go away right now into the questions box and type what your question is, and I'll read it out, and then Jerry and Peter, or both, either or both, will respond to the question for you. The first one we have here is from Krista. And Krista says, many people have a negative view on measuring, and I think it means measuring in general, and they report numbers they don't know the purpose of and feel like they're reporting them into a black hole. They have experienced the measures we use to control them. And so it feels leaders need to understand the benefits of using measures for learning. So that kind of speaks quite a bit to the polarity that you actually chose, Peter, to talk about. Is there anything else you would say in response to Krista?
Yes, yes. It talks to this polarity, but I think it's taking people through the journey of understanding the difference between managing and learning, and understanding that these are interdependent. Because managing is, as I said earlier, is about ensuring that things are done right, which is about your quality measures, etc. And people need to understand that perspective of measures and know that those measures are very different from the measures we use to measure strategy, which is the ones we use to measure under PuMP. If we develop under PuMP, the KPIs, what I call KPIs, which are for learning, whether things are working or not. And you find the two are interdependent, because the measures we use to make sure that things are done right, the quality measures, task measures, etc., end up being an explanation of the result measures. And in most cases, we monitor these on a daily, etc., to ensure we reduce the variations in the system. So understanding the interdependency of the measures, the relationship of these measures, is very important. And understanding that people are normally held accountable in most cases for task measures because they carry out the tasks, but they cannot be held accountable for results measures. So understanding that is very, very important. So it's a journey of getting people to understand. That's what I believe. And understand the different dimensions of performance. Are we talking about strategic performance? Are we talking about operational effectiveness, perspective of performance? So those understanding that very important, and that's why this polarity of managing and learning could be very useful for you, Krista, in getting people to understand.
I think you mentioned before, Peter, that this is a tool. Jerry, you mentioned it too. I think that this is a tool. The polarity map is a tool for a conversation and a discussion, and it kind of adds a visual dimension to a discussion about that difference between the operational effectiveness and strategic measures. So that's I love any tool that makes dialogue more meaningful. So I think it could do that too. Next question is from Judy. And Judy's saying, I'm looking for ways to let people let go of their old way of developing performance measures. That is to just give someone a task and then have it go through some sort of clearance process. I think what Judy's describing there is that, the old way of developing performance measures, you just tell somebody to come up with something, and then someone will either tick it off as a good measure and accept it, or they won't. Is there some, advice from polarity thinking that could help Judy?
What I can say, Judy, is that yes, there is an old way and a new way. The old way has got its positives. There are values in the old ways that people will hold on to. They'll not want to give up that. And in this conversation, in the polarity conversation, it helps you to engage people, listen to their views, they listen to yours, you sell PuMP to them, they tell you what it is, they will not let go. And in that conversation, you are able to determine what you can keep from the old way and what you need to help people, to support people to get rid of. A lot of times, it's not that people don't know that PuMP is good and it is important. It's just that they don't want to let go of what they think is important. They will not let go until you acknowledge, you appreciate that, yes, we had this way, and now we have to let go of it. So sometimes the conversation, like Stacey says, changing the conversation using the performance measure angle and the old ways brings people together. And it is a journey. It doesn't happen instantly.
Just to add on what Njeri has said, seeing the polarity in what you're saying, Judy, could also help, unlock this problem. For instance, I can see the polarity of empowerment and control. We want to grant people measures because we want to control them. Empowerment, which is the new way, you want people to decide on their own measures and implement. So being able to having conversations, as Njeri was saying, and seeing the polarities in there, coming up with a polarity map could help you move people, or leverage on those polarities to achieve, to improve performance, to use measures to improve performance. So I try to look out to see the polarities whenever there's these situations. We're talking about always, but what are the polarities there between the old and the new, and how can we leverage on them? And that's where polarity thinking becomes very powerful as a tool for dialogue and a tool to move people forward.
So, Peter, what you're suggesting is an example of a potential polarity for that exploring the old way, exploring the new way, is that polarity between control and empowerment and exploring that. But that could be just one. There could be other polarities that come out of the old way versus the new way.
Yes, there could be others. So seeing those polarities, identifying them, having a conversation, identifying them, mapping them out, that could help.
Yeah, cool. And so what Njeri was saying before was that we'd really talk to them and say, what is it about the old way that's important to you that you don't want to let go of? And someone may say control, but someone else may also say, well, I just don't want to spend a lot of time doing this. I want measures to be efficient. And about the new way, you do the same sort of thing. So for each situation, understanding that polarity mapping process can help people draw out the polarity that's relevant in their own situation, their own organization. Yeah?
That's correct.
It's so powerful. It's so flexible. Lovely. Well, look, this is a challenge for me. Robert's got the next question, and Robert's asking how could you go about promoting the benefits of PuMP certification? And I'm imagining Robert might be in an organisation where there've been a lot of people that have had PuMP training, but they're not really taking the certification exam, going to that next level. I think that's what Robert might mean. Is there a way that polarity thinking can help Robert to do that, to sort of promote the benefits of the PuMP certification?
Yes, there is. Faith, do you want to give a go at that?
Yeah, let me give it a try. Yeah, so Robert, when you talk about PuMP, when you talk about accreditation, you're actually asking people to take up a change that they will start using. And sometimes the benefit of the certification may not come out if people have not quite bought into the PuMP process. They don't see the benefit of it. I mean, what is in it for me? Why bother to sit for an exam? I don't need the certificate. And the approach I would take is the same approach I would take with any other change movement. And to speak to what Peter said earlier, it is important for you to have a polarity mindset when you're thinking through this, even before you engage people. And if, for example, you are using the polarity map, you can actually fill out the upsides of getting accredited, the downsides of not getting accredited, and then the upsides of what the people are working with, not getting accredited. You identify a polarity, a pole that speaks to that. And you can engage people in a conversation where you playfully fill in that map. And you'll be surprised what you'll come up with. What I have found with the polarity map is that because you're dealing with the two sides of the rights, the two sides of what people believe in, conversation becomes pretty easy. And it helps to remove the defenses that perhaps people have put on themselves and which prevent you from knowing exactly what they are thinking. So I would actually use a polarity map to have a conversation before I come up with a position that may be wrong to deal with this.
So Robert, the two poles you can work with perhaps is knowledge and certification or accreditation. You could start with that as two poles and work with that and see if you can develop a map and promote the benefits of accreditation.
Oh, I like that. That's so good. I wasn't sure how the two of you would come up with something for Robert's question, but that sounds brilliant. We have a question here from Jeffrey. Or maybe it's not a question so much as a comment, but it'll be interesting what both of you would say in response to it. So Jeffrey says, there is a grey line between people not using PuMP for people performance and holding parties accountable for process performance. So there's, well, let me have a go at this and you can tell me that I'm wrong, but straight away a polarity pops up there for me about on one pole would be people performance and the other pole would be potentially process performance.
Exactly.
I may be wrong.
You're spot on. You're spot on. Yes, we could look at them that way, people performance and process performance. And you can delve into that polarity and work on that. And that thin line or gray line kind of disappears. You realize that you need both. You need people to do what they're meant to do, to carry out their tasks, but you need also the process to perform. And this actually, if you look at the manage and learn pole, this tends to be a more detailed polarity under that, So yes, so you're spot on, Stacey.
No, I like it. Thanks for asking that one, Jeffrey. That's great. We're over time now. There is one question left. Jerry and Peter, do you want to spend an extra few minutes just finishing up with this last question? Do you have time for that?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Thank you. So this one's from Gary. And Gary has said, PuMP adoption is proving most difficult for us when the results map is difficult to define and get agreement on. So obviously they're struggling to get a results map that everyone's comfortable with. He says, everyone wants to jump this step or skip this step, but it's crucial in determining the best measures. Can polarity thinking help Gary too?
Yes, indeed it can. Yeah. Okay. Go on, Gary. Go on.
Yes. Adoption is proving most difficult for us when the result map is difficult to define and get an agreement. Again, I'll say here, you've got people who are in different positions. There are those who perhaps feel they have a better way of developing their results or their outcomes. And remember, the result map is process driven, and not everybody might be aware of that. So again, here I would use a polarity map before we start developing the result map, again to identify the poles that, or the polarities that are at play, and then involve the people in completing the polarity map. When you engage people in this conversation, it always brings out issues or problems that wouldn't come out if you do it any other way. Peter, you want to add on to that?
No, I think you said it all. I think the secret is in the ability to see the different realities. You know, those who want to skip the process because they find it difficult, and those who would like to develop a result map, finding that reality, you know, and having that conversation, or the polarities, and having that conversation would enable you unlock whatever stuckness that is there, and therefore the need to jump. You know, people will see the value of why you need to create the map. Yeah. So the secret is in being able to see polarities. As Jerry said at the beginning, polarities are all around us. They live with us. You know, these are energy systems. They live with us, and you know, success comes in if we are able to see them and leverage on them, so that everybody, we carry everybody along. And you know, I think that's the secret, guy.
That's tremendous. I love that this is an inclusive kind of approach. I love that it doesn't make anyone wrong. So there's absolutely no threat whatsoever that comes with having a polarity conversation. And I'm not sure if I'm reading too much into it, but it also sounds like you don't necessarily need to start with identifying the perfect words at each pole in the polarity. You can actually start with just exploring, you know, for those the group of people that, for example, don't want to do the results map, what are the upsides that they're trying to hang on to? And for the people who do want to do the results map, what are the upsides that they're trying to move toward? And then maybe out of exploring that in conversation, the polarity, the poles in the polarity, the labels for them become a little bit more obvious. Is that a possibility?
Yes, it is a possibility. Actually, anytime you sense a struggle in awareness in yourself and with others, usually it's an indicator that there is a polarity at play. And therefore you start from there. You start from what you are sensing.
Yeah.
You collect the insights around you. And I mean, you keep building on the polarity map. You keep changing. It is an ongoing process. It never stops, because remember, polarities are unsolvable. You can never say, for example, that I'm done with the issue of race, discrimination. It's an ongoing dance that never ever comes to an end. And usually a good metaphor that we use when we are describing polarities is in breathing. You breathe in and it makes you feel good, but you cannot breathe in for too long. Otherwise, things will go so wrong for you. You breathe in, you breathe out. It's an ongoing oscillation, and that's the same way polarities work. They are there whether we like it or not. We experience them as tension. We experience them as dilemmas. We experience them as resistance.
This webcast for me has made me appreciate so much more how beautiful polarities are as a tool. Even in the words that you've both used to describe them and introduce them to us, like you know, balance and playfulness and dialogue and all those, that kind of language just makes it feel like such a positive thing to do. And it's for me, it's been absolutely revelational. So Jetty and Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to to share this with us. Thanks so much for taking the time to blend it with PuMP, because it's adding a facet to PuMP implementation that it just has never been there before, to make it easier and more engaging and far less threatening to introduce a new idea, a new change that PuMP is. So thank you both so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you for having us.
That's my pleasure. Well, everybody, I hope you've gotten even a fraction of the value that I've personally taken from what Njeri and Peter have shared with us. Like always, the replay of this webcast will be available in the PuMP community forever, and you can watch the replay and also download, if you didn't get the handout, you can download it from there as well, and we'll email you once the replay is ready. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you again, Njeri and Peter. And for now, this is the three of us signing off until next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.